Burzine Waghmar, Inaugural Indian Visiting Fellow, Royal United Services Institute, that's RUSI, member of SOAS's South Asia Institute, is going to contrast Sino-Iranian-Indian national security responses to the war in Ukraine, evaluating and contrasting the distinct takes by all three of these Asian neighbors and their strategic interests. Burzine Waghmar, tell us what you know.
Thank you, Lord Bruce, and the Democracy Forum for having me to share my thoughts on this trio, Sino-Irano-Indian takes, national security responses to the Ukraine crisis. Even 72 hours prior to Putin's invasion of Ukraine, it was quite conceivable that on 21st February, when he lambasted Lenin for encouraging Ukrainians to think of themselves as a distinct people, these war clouds gathering over Kyiv would cast no shadows, much less put Beijing, Tehran, and New Delhi around the rim, if not the eye of the storm. It is plain 56 days into this conflict that all three republics, Iranian, Indian, and Chinese, have reason to wish this war away, but cannot, given their wagons hitched with the belligerent to varying degrees. I discuss here then, taking a cue from Cold War speak, of what one would have termed an arc of crisis across South and Southwest Asia, as coined by Carter's national security advisor, the late Zbigniew Brzezinski. It may not be entirely irrelevant to the present, but let me also recall here the late and great Bernard Lewis of SOAS, my varsity, who stated in a slim volume tersely entitled The Future of the Middle East in 1997, quote, "Sooner or later, Russia will be back, and we do not know what kind of Russia that will be. It may fall subject to some form of totalitarian tyranny, fascist or communist. It may resume its earlier role as the leader of pan-Slavism or Orthodox Christianity. It may succeed after so many failed efforts. It may resume or reject its former imperial ambitions. But this much can be said with certainty, that whatever kind of regime rules in a resurgent Russia, it will be vitally concerned with the Middle East, a region not far from its southern frontier, wherever that may ultimately lie." Close quote. Appropriate then to turn south of the border and regard what Khrushchev once quipped about Iran, a rotten apple that will eventually fall into our lap. Doveryai, no proveryai. Trust but verify, as the Russian rhyming proverb goes. Doubtless Putin does, as he pursues a policy of mollifying Tehran, turning to the east, Pavarot na Vostok, what with Russo-Persian ties over 200 years, marked by suspicion, occupation, and outright wars, 1651 to 1828. Both Moscow and Tehran concur on challenging the liberal rules-based system of governance and interstate relations by portraying their posturing as that of anti-hegemonic struggles against American unipolarity. Both regimes, alongside China, are, as Anne Applebaum recently told BBC Newsnight, have a single enemy, quote, democratic activism and the language of liberal democracy. That the sunset clause come 2025 is as eagerly sought by the mullahs as the return of the hidden imam merits no reiteration. Iran, under a hardliner president as Ibrahim Raisi, will rule out any return to the July 2015 JCPOA, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action Agreement. It will present unreasonable demands and bid for time. And why not? Official rhetoric aside, Tehran already has, according to Faridun Abbas Davani, ex-head of the Iranian Atomic Energy Organization, a system to create a nuclear weapon. Uranium enrichment at the end of 2021 stood at 60%, and Israeli intelligence, shared with the US and European allies, convincingly demonstrates the Persians are aiming for 90% purity. That billions of pounds could be unlocked thanks to any deal signed at Vienna will assuredly be channeled to Lebanese, Syrian, and Yemeni militias across the region. With Russia sanctioned, Tehran is also eyeing opportunities to ramp up hydrocarbon exports, what with the discovery of a new and massive Caspian gas basin in Chaluz. Israel may well criticize the Western community of dithering and kicking the can down the road. But Prime Minister Bennett, who did vote in favor of condemning Moscow at the General Assembly, knows how Putin will retaliate in Syria, where he has turned a Nelson's eye and tolerated Israeli target operations against Hezbollah and IRGC operatives, the Pasdaran. Israel's dilemma naturally mirrors that of the Arab Gulf sheikdoms, still peeved with Obama for this nuclear deal, as well as Biden, who is more worked up about Jamal Khashoggi than anything else. Not for nothing did Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman refuse to take his telephone call last month. He regarded it pointless, just as American Secretary of State Anthony Blinken dismissed as, quote, irrelevant his Russian counterpart's requirement of, quote, written guarantees that Western sanctions will by no means affect Moscow's right to full trade, investment, and military ties with Tehran, should something be inked in Vienna. Russia, it will be recalled, was supposed to be the recipient of surplus uranium processed by Tehran under the 2015 agreement, as well as enable producing stable isotopes and supplying fuel for the research reactor located in Tehran's suburbs. Not that Moscow, it may be highlighted, desires to see a nuclear Iran, nor military intervention if talks fail. Tehran, too, for its part, will demand written guarantees that no future American administration will trash a second deal. It may not, for domestic consumption, admit to a revival of the JCPOA and publicly praise Moscow as a strategic partner. But there is precious little that can be foreseen unless actual bilateral talks with Washington occur, something Iran refuses and Israel fears, quite rightly, as Biden will give away too much. Biden, on the other hand, feels India has given too little. Privately, Washington, like London, appreciates that New Delhi is in hock to then Soviet, now Russian weaponry. I adduce here my letter published last month in the Financial Times on that bugbear of Indian foreign policy, strategic autonomy, wherein I stated, quote, your leader is partly true when recalling Indian reluctance to condemn the USSR during the non-aligned era. India was also silent during the East Berlin workers' uprising in 1953 when there was no strategic compulsion. Indo-GDR diplomatic relations were only established 2 decades later in 1973, the very decade Indo-Soviet military cooperation took off. There is a marked Indian aversion to interfere even when much more economically and politically is at stake. New Delhi abstained from joining the International Coalition to Liberate Kuwait, and its tightrope balancing act between the GCC, Gulf Cooperation Council, versus Iraq enabled it to ride out that imbroglio. India is aware Putin has been more voluble than Xi Jinping in deploring its decision to join the Indo-Pacific Quad dialogue. Strategic autonomy, not residual Indo-Soviet bonhomie, led it to cancel a recent Russian order for 21 MiG-29 jets, helicopters, and anti-tank weapons, close quote. There are admittedly reservoirs of goodwill towards Moscow within not just the Indian intelligentsia, both right and left, but also the populace. A constant refrain on social media among irate Indians is how the USSR came to its aid during the Third Indo-Pakistan War of 1971. They conveniently forget Kennedy saved Nehru's and India's skin in 1962. Nor do these Indians, enthralled to Russian armaments, pause to consider that between 1947 and 2012, India, more so than even Israel, was the largest universal American recipient of developmental assistance worth $65.1 billion. But this does not implicitly imply that Indians are reticent to criticize Moscow. Old hands at the Indian Foreign Office privately reminisce what a hard bargainer the USSR, like Russia, has been on trade and military deals. Indo-Russian ties are driven, make no mistake, by hard-boiled pragmatism. Indian aversion in denouncing the Russian invasion was driven by its desire not to get on China's wrong side. But Sino-Indian frontier flare-ups and fatalities have been ongoing since 2017, and Putin has been far more vocal, as I pointed out, in his displeasure of India joining the Quad. neither a pariah Putin nor any successor will pull Indian chestnuts out of the fire. Mikhail Gorbachev, as last visiting Soviet premier, made it plain to the Indians in November 1986 that the USSR cannot be counted upon during any future Sino-Indian showdown. The Soviets, like the Indians in 1962, had a brief border war with Mao in 1969. Gorbachev oversaw the first joint demarcation settlement in May 1991, and that 30-year-old Sino-Russian boundary dispute was formally declared resolved by both parties in December 1999. Universally, India is the third largest military spender after the US and China, and second largest importer of weapons after Saudi Arabia. Since 2007, Washington has secured Indian deals over $21 billion. New Delhi has spent over $800 billion in arms deals during the last 15 years. Moscow, since the 70s, still is its largest supplier and spare parts provider. But it will take time before India begins to not just diversify, but also ramp up indigenization. Some 310 items have been added since 2020 by the Indian government to a list of banned imports to not only encourage domestic production of weapons systems, technologies, and ammunition in its public and private sectors, vital during a post-pandemic recovery, but also to contain strategic vulnerabilities such as software breaches of newer defense and electronic platforms. And these breaches naturally brings me to conclude by discussing the mendacious link in this trio, the PRC, People's Republic of China. Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping can self-congratulate themselves on Sino-Russian ties as having, quote, no limits. Saccharine shades of Sino-Pakistani affirmations of, quote, higher than the Himalayas, deeper than the deepest sea, and sweeter than honey friendship talks all very well. But violent attacks against Chinese diplomats and Pakistani forces continue across Balochistan, the CPEC, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor terminus, and elsewhere, as Beijing wields 28% of Islamabad's external debt. While India dispatches medical aid to Ukraine, Beijing blocks Premier League matches lest its denizens watch full-throated Britons intersperse cheers for their home team with those for President Zelensky and doubting Ukrainians. She thought it would all be over within a few weeks and had counted on Putin's tacit assurance. Clearly, everything has gone pear-shaped for the Chinese, who were beholden that Putin postponed this invasion after the games so as to not steal their thunder and maintain public deniability of it, as well as mounting cyber attacks on almost 600 websites of the Ministry of Defense, State Railways, Ukrainian National Bank, among others, on the eve of the invasion, 23rd February. Ukrainian State Security SBU noticed a spike in attacks 24 hours before the war broke out and already underway since the games ended. This SBU also maintained, according to a report carried in the Times, 2nd April, page 6, that these attacks were distinct from those carried out by Russians to shut and disrupt their systems, given their telltale tools and methods as those routinely deployed by the People's Liberation Army's Cyber Warfare Unit, ergo, the Chinese deep state. China is known to hold offshore bonds and engaging, like Russia, in illegal currency transactions. Ben Stile, Director of International Economics at the Council of Foreign Relations, surmises that should the Russian central bank need greenbacks, Chinese banks could sell their treasury holdings, pass the dollars back to the People's Bank of China, who in turn would credit them to the Russian central bank's account. He maintains, quote, if we are right about the money flows we've tracked, the Russian central bank has at least $80 billion in treasury $80 billion in treasury bonds, as well as Chinese renminbi and gold, which it could liquidate to pay its bills without much difficulty, close quote. But China is in for the waiting game. It knows which side its bow is buttered. Sino-Russian bilateral trade is 87 billion pounds, compared to that with the West at 950 billion. So the Chinese are justifiably leery. State-run energy consortium Sinopec has pulled out of Russian gas marketing venture worth $500 million to avoid sanctions. China knows it is deeply integrated in Western supply chains, and the pain would be mutual and not affect just us. Holding the world's largest foreign exchange reserves is all very well, but not if you lose access to it. Nor is China all that self-sufficient in energy or food. Ukraine may have temporarily distracted focus away from the South China Sea, but Premier for Life Xi is still recovering from realizing the resolve of decadent Westerners who were long held as lacking the will to fight or ability to take a stand. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. There's a huge